very warm welcome, a good evening or a good day, depending on where you're joining us from. For those of you who don't know me, I am Shirley Gilbert. I am Professor of Modern Jewish History at University College London, and I'm also the director of the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre, which was established in 2018 in memory of the late British historian, who, by the way, is no relation to me. Sir Martin was, of course, the official biographer of Sir Winston Churchill, but he also was a very prolific historian, working in many other different subjects, including particularly the First and Second World Wars, the history of Israel, and the modern Jewish experience. So all of our programming is around those subject areas. And Sir Martin was, of course, not only a master chronicler, but really a master communicator who engaged a lot with public audiences. And so fittingly, that our aim at the centre is to bring the best historical research to a broad, non-academic public. And in addition to the kinds of programs like these public programs of the kind that you're attending today, we also work with secondary schools to provide teachers with resources based on primary materials and the latest historical scholarship. Our aim at the centre is really to keep as many of our events as possible free at the point of access so that we can reach that very wide audience. So if you would like to contribute any amount, however big or small, we are always very, very grateful for that, and it's easy to donate on our website. So having said all of that, I'm really delighted this evening to be able to welcome my colleague from University College London, Professor Neill Lochery. Neill is Professor of Middle Eastern and Mediterranean Studies at UCL, and he's a world-renowned expert on Mediterranean history in particular. He's the author of 14 books, including a series of critically acclaimed works that focus on World War II. And he's also written several important books about the Middle East peace process. Today, he's going to be talking to us about more of a World War II focused topic. This is his latest book, which has just been released in the United Kingdom, and I understand will soon be released in the US. And the title of that book, which is also the title of his talk tonight, is Cashing Out: World War II and the Flight of Nazi Treasure. So without any further ado, I'll pass over to Neill.
Thank you very much, Shirley, and welcome everyone to the talk this evening. Just going to share my screen with you first of all with the presentation and put that up. And then hopefully you can all see the presentation. Tremendous, great. Well, thank you very much for the invite. It's a great honor to speak at the Martin Gilbert Learning Centre. Martin was someone I looked up to very much when I was a young scholar. And for those interested, I gave a talk many years ago at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, which was the Churchill lecture, part of a symposium on World War II, in which, as well as talking about some of the things I talk about tonight, I talked a little bit about the importance of Sir Martin's work on World War II, and specifically his work on Churchill in World War II. Tonight, as Shirley said, I'm going to be talking about my new book, which is called Cashing Out, which I'm really thrilled to share with you tonight, which is being published in New York by Public Affairs Book, which is part of the Hachette Book Group. And it's just come out this month here in the United Kingdom and in Europe. And this book, which I'm going to talk to you about tonight, is really the successor to another book I wrote in World War II, which was called Lisbon: War in the Shadows of the City of Light, which came out about a decade ago, and which told the story of Portugal and its role in the war, and specifically from a Jewish-centric point of view, its role in allowing and helping and aiding and abetting Jewish refugees escape Europe. And just finally, the third book in my little trilogy of books is my book on Brazil in World War II, which is relevant to what I'm going to talk about tonight. And this was a book I wrote about the very significant role of Brazil and the fact that not many people know that Brazil fought on the Allied side in World War II from 1942, and its soldiers fought in some of the bloodiest battles in Italy. And indeed, the first surrender by a German general in Italy was given to a Brazilian general, much to the confusion of the Nazi general. And this book I would recommend for those of you interested in a good tale of World War II espionage and trade. So the book I wrote, Cashing Out, is really part of this journey that I'm on books on World War II. And the journey, as I said, is taking me from Portugal through Brazil and naturally through other countries as well, in particular Argentina and Spain. And for this book, Cashing Out, I also brought in 2 other countries as well, Sweden and Switzerland. And the main focus of this book is to look specifically at how the neutral countries, or the so-called neutral countries in World War II, benefited enormously during World War II with their trade with Germany, and also how they were effectively utilized by the Germans in the final years of the war, and in particular, really from D-Day onwards, so from June 1944 onwards, as points of exit, not only for themselves, but more specifically for looted art and looted treasure. And you may have seen Hollywood movies such as The Monuments Men, in which the Americans laud their great successes in Germany in recovering looted art. But I have to say, in terms of the neutral countries, the Allied efforts, as I will outline to you in the lecture tonight, were really well short of successful. And this is something that has still been very much an ongoing issue. And in 2024, I'll bring the issue of looted art later in the lecture up to date. But just to start with, let me just run through the neutrals and their, if you like, their school report on World War II. And the neutrals I've looked at in my book, and I'm not going to tell you the whole story because the book is a very tight narrative history, and I want to intrigue you enough so you hopefully go out and read the book in full. But just to get your interest going, the neutrals that I looked at were Argentina, and Argentina was neutral until the final months of the war, when under strong American pressure, it was forced to join the Allied side. But even during this period, when it was officially a belligerent in the war, the Argentines were leaning towards the Nazis and had been trading extensively with the Nazis. And from mid-1944 onwards, had been preparing systematically rat lines to aid and abet the escape of Nazis wishing to exit Europe at the end of the war. And these rat lines were essentially set up in Spain under the nose of General Francisco Franco, the leader of Spain. And they were largely had 2 groups of participants in, members of the Argentine military regime and intelligence operatives were dispatched to Madrid and to Barcelona to prepare the rat lines, and also members of the Argentine Catholic Church. And some very senior figures at cardinal level were involved in the setting up of these rat lines. And the man behind all this, who was, at this stage, the backseat driver in Argentina, was Juan Perón. And I'm sure you've heard of that name before. And in 1946, after the war, Juan Perón moves from being the backseat driver, if you like, to the front seat driver when he's elected president of Argentina, much to the annoyance of the Americans. And it's at that stage that Argentina really starts to become a safe haven for German escaping war criminals, but also looted art as well. And I'll return to that later. Brazil, which is often mistaken rather for Argentina in accounts of World War II, Brazil remained neutral until the final part of 1942, when, following attacks by German U-boats on Brazilian shipping, Brazil joined the war on the Allied side. And Brazil, as I mentioned, sent a large military force to Europe in 1943, which fought in Italy, fought very bravely in Italy. And Brazil, largely because of a Hollywood movie called Notorious, made by the famous filmmaker Alfred Hitchcock, which became one of the major big Hollywood hits of the post-World War II era, painted Brazil as essentially a safe haven for Nazi war criminals in this period. This was not true. The vast majority of Nazi war criminals went to Argentina. It was only later, following Mossad's arrest of, or kidnapping, sorry, of Adolf Eichmann in 1960, that Brazil, following a military coup, becomes something of a safe haven for escaping Nazis from Argentina. Portugal, which was neutral all the way through the war, despite having the world's oldest diplomatic alliance with Great Britain, dating back to 1373, which is still in place today, and indeed an alliance which, much to the confusion of the British Parliament in 1943, Sir Winston Churchill invoked the alliance to allow British access to a crucial Portuguese airbase in the Azores Islands in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Churchill, in doing this, became actually only, I believe, I think he became the first man to actually invoke the treaty. The second time it was invoked was during the Falklands War of 1982, when the British wanted to use the same airbase in its conflict with Argentina. And the Portuguese connection with all of this is that Portugal traded massively in a rare ore called tungsten or wolfram with the Germans, which was an essential ingredient for the German war machine, for the armaments industry, used to harden steel, to make bullets, to make shells, in armor plating, a huge range of uses for it. And Portugal, by 1943, was supplying around about 90% of the German wolfram needs. Without wolfram, the German armaments machine would have ground to a halt. Now, Portugal was hugely rewarded in its trade with Nazi Germany because the Germans paid round about 400 to 500% more than the market value of wolfram. The Portuguese upped the prices, and for the Germans, this was not a problem because they were essentially paying for this wolfram with gold, and the gold had been stolen from the central banks of countries that Germany had occupied during the initial stages of the war. So initially from Eastern Europe, and then from countries such as the central banks of Holland and Belgium. From about late 42, 43 onwards, it was also clear that the Germans were utilizing gold that had been stolen from Jewish victims of the Holocaust. Gold teeth, wedding bands melted down and shaped into gold bars. So the Germans were willing and able to pay top dollar, if you like, for this wolfram. And we know that when the war ended, that Portugal had at least 400 tons of Nazi gold. My estimates on it are actually something like double that, which makes Portugal in 2024 still one of the richest countries in terms of gold reserves, which it has. We'll return to this later, but moving on to Spain. Spain officially wasn't a neutral country. It was termed a non-belligerent country, a rather weird title. But essentially, Spain leant more towards the Axis side. There was enormous concern as to whether or not General Franco, who had been reliant upon the Axis power, Italy and Germany during the Spanish Civil War for military support, specifically in terms of air power from the Luftwaffe, whether or not Franco would throw his lot in with the Germans. And people such as Ian Fleming from Naval Military Intelligence in London were busy preparing Operation GoldenEye for the event of a German takeover of Spain and what the British would do to try to sort of gain some control over areas like Gibraltar, strategically vitally important, of course, at the mouth of the Mediterranean. Well, Sir Winston Churchill had a better idea how to keep Spain on board, and that was a good old case of let's bribe the guy. And during World War II, the British bribed General Franco, senior generals, key members of the political elite, particularly from the Falangist movement in Spain, by paying them millions of dollars. And these transactions really only came released in the National Archives in the UK around about the 1990s to 2000. But we know that it was round about $13 million in 1945 that was paid, from 39 to 45 that was paid to the Spanish. I can't work out in my head how much that is worth today, but that's certainly a lot of money in 2024. But it worked. Spain remained out of the war, but Spain traded with the Germans and became a very lucrative area for looted art, which I will come to later. The country which shocked me the most was Sweden. I always thought of Sweden as a very good example of neutrality, but little did I know when I started this research how much Sweden was actually trading with Germany. Its main area was iron ore, but there were many other examples of trade between the two countries. And indeed, the trade between Sweden and the Nazis predated World War II. They'd actually started trading when the Nazis came to power at the start of the 1930s. And by the mid-1930s, there were many joint Swedish-German companies. And in terms of this book, and the areas that I look at the book, Sweden was handsomely paid by the Germans for its trade, and also offered a very nice way out for Germans trying to smuggle looted art into Sweden and out of Sweden towards South America. And at the end of the war, Sweden also was a relatively popular route for Nazis escaping Europe, specifically not so much German Nazis, but Nazis linked to the Baltic republics who'd committed some terrible atrocities. They were among some of the first wave of Nazis fleeing Europe and heading towards South America. I talk about Switzerland, the final neutral power in the book. I talk about it as being the sort of center of all these activities. It was involved in almost every aspect of it. It was involved in looted art. Germans liked to sell looted art in Switzerland because they wanted to get Swiss francs, which was deemed to be a very safe currency to hold during the war. And of course, the Germans also utilized the strict privacy laws in Switzerland in terms of storing looted art, gold, treasure in safe deposit boxes. And this was clearly a very successful route for many Nazis. And the Swiss were, of course, all too happy really to turn the other way and not investigate very much of this. I don't cover Switzerland as much in the book because, as I would have liked to have, because of it's been done so many times before by other scholars, and B, I just thought Switzerland was almost beyond the pale anyway. So I sort of have it as a kind of a location where the Germans, of course, utilized their close connections with Switzerland. And the Swiss record in World War II, and we could talk about other issues such as its turning away of thousands of Jewish refugees from its borders, was really, really appalling. And that's something perhaps to be raised at another time. Two other countries that didn't make the list. One was Ireland. Irish neutrality greatly antagonized Sir Winston Churchill. He lost sleep over it. He raged at the Irish for their unpatriotic actions, and particularly when German U-boats docked in Irish ports. But Irish neutrality was very much based on a sort of, I think, an anti-British stance, or a reflection of the state of Irish-British relations at the time, rather than any attempts by Ireland to act as a safe haven for German war criminals. I don't know of any stories of German officers after the war drinking a pint of Guinness in downtown Dublin, nor do I know of much trade between Ireland as well and Germany. Other country I left out was Turkey, because Turkey was a little bit different. It fitted a sort of different aspect. There were Nazi war criminals who came through Turkey at the end of the war, particularly a couple of individuals who headed to Syria and who made their homes in Syria. But Turkey was a somewhat a different issue altogether. So what were the key issues? Well, the key issues that I cover in the book are really trade between the Germans and the neutrals. And this trade, as I mentioned, from a Portuguese point of view, was essentially in wolfram, tungsten, which was extremely necessary for the German war machine. Spain also sent some wolfram from mines in the north of Spain as well. Sweden sending iron ore. Argentina sending foodstuffs to the Germans. And all of this, I think, is important to look at in two different ways. And the way I've sort of looked at it in the book is, I think, from a much more moralistic way, which is this correct, or was this correct? And should these countries have been able to keep hold of their wartime bounty from trading with the Germans? I mean, should they have been forced by the Allies to effectively return all their benefits, especially after they knew, and they did know, we know from documents in Spain, we know from documents in Portugal, and from documents in Sweden, that they did know from 1943 onwards that a lot of this gold was coming from Jewish victims of the Holocaust, and that this was something which, to quote the Portuguese dictator Antonio Oliveira Salazar, he regarded as an internal Third Reich issue and not an issue for Portugal to worry about. So I look at it from a sort of moralistic point of view. There is, of course, another way to look at it, and that is from a security point of view. And this is a defense that's often put out by the neutrals like Portugal, Spain, and Sweden. And in simple terms, it's this, that if we didn't sell these goods to the Nazis, they would have simply invaded and come and got them. That in effect, our neutrality would have ended anyway, and that Portugal, Spain, Sweden would have been invaded by the Germans. And the Swedes, of course, cite the fact that Germany invaded Denmark, Germany invaded Norway, their two neighboring countries. There was a sense in Portugal that the Germans were very much looking to invade the country, perhaps through a proxy invasion using Spanish forces. And we know from documentary evidence from the British intelligence archives that Spain and Germany did indeed have plans to invade Portugal in 1943. But due to operations in the East, these plans shifted. So the defense of many of these neutral countries is based on their security. Yes, we made profit from this trade, but we did so in order to protect the integral borders and independence of our country. And for example, in Portugal, Salazar went further and reminded the world that Portugal had been fought over in the Peninsular Wars by the British and the French, who had largely destroyed much of Portugal in their wars. The British had launched a scorched earth policy as ordered by the Duke of Wellington, burning all the crops in the country in order to prevent them falling into French hands. But of course, this led to starvation amongst the Portuguese. And in World War I, Portugal had joined the war in 1916, 2 years after the start of the war, and fought on the Allied side. suffering enormous casualties, even by World War I standards, as their boys fell in Belgium, where they were based. And this led to essentially the end of Portuguese democracy and the military dictatorship following the war as political instability rose, and then eventually the rise of Salazar as a civilian dictator in that country. So their defense is extremely important, I think, to take that into effect. But that's not the only issue in the book. The book is also, and largely, I think, about looted art and treasure as well. And this is, I think, is an issue that's been looked at, but it hasn't really been looked at in detail in relation to the neutral countries and how the neutral countries were effectively utilized as in two ways. The first way, as a means of selling looted art directly on the open market in these countries. And this took many different forms. We know from evidence police records that there were many private auctions in which the uber wealthy in countries, particularly Spain and Portugal, bought pieces of art, and that there was a very large market for this, particularly from 1943 onwards. The second use of the neutrals was as a point of exit for the art. Now, this art wasn't, carried around by guys in big frames. The Germans ruthlessly cut the art out of the frames, rolled it up, and often put 50 or 60 paintings together, rolled it up, shoved it into a kit bag. I mean, my wife, who does museum conservation, would have had a heart attack if she'd seen what the Germans were doing to these pieces of art. And they smuggled them out of Europe. And they smuggled them out of Europe to Argentina mainly. And the points of exit were Bilbao, mainly in the north of Spain, Lisbon, and Porto in Portugal, with their deep water ports and their frequent shipping connections with South America. In Argentina, this art was often sold to wealthy middle-class Argentines. There was a big penchant for European art in Argentina, and it was a sort of social status symbol, if you like. And they were quite open, and they had no interest really in knowing anything about where this art had come from. And the third area was, of course, aiding and abetting Nazi war criminals escaping. And a lot of work has been done about the Italian rat lines. My colleague at UCL, Filippo Sanz, has written a fantastic book about the setting up of the escape line through Italy and the collusion of collaboration of the Vatican and senior officials in the Catholic Church in aiding and abetting Nazis escaping. What I've written about in this book is going the other way, heading west, and the establishment of escape lines through Spain and through Portugal into South America. And here there were two waves of escape. The first really happening directly after the war, end of 1945, 1946. Many of these people escaping were quite junior in rank, but had committed terrible atrocities. And then the second wave, which was much more senior in 1948, 49. And that second wave included much more senior officials, such as Klaus Barbie and Adolf Eichmann. And the second wave, I think, of the more senior leaders had effectively waited to see how successful the first wave of escape had been to Argentina, what sort of reception they got, how secure Argentina was, etc. Just to have a look at the very picture here, there are two men in this picture that are significant. The man on the left is the Spanish dictator, General Francisco Franco, and the man in the middle with the Homburg hat on is Antonio Oliveira Salazar, the dictator of Portugal. Both these men, interestingly, survived the war and carried on their rule. Salazar survived in power until 1968 when a stroke incapacitated him. And Franco carried on until the mid-1970s. So they didn't meet the similar fates to other European dictators. It's quite a rare photograph of them together. Not very often were photographed together. But this was a meeting taken during World War II. So how did the Allies respond to all of this? What was the Allied response? And the Allied response was framed at Bretton Woods, the conference which dealt with economic issues in July 1944 in the United States. And Article 6 of Bretton Woods dealt with the very issues in the neutral countries which I've talked about. German assets, potentially German war criminals escaping, trade between the two countries, between the neutrals and Germany, and the question of looted art in these countries. And this was a very sort of formula set up by the Allies. It was American-led. And out of this came one of the most famous operations, Operation Safe Haven. And Operation Safe Haven ran from effectively 1944 up until 1948. And this was the operation which was both British and American-led, and an operation which was meant to deal successfully with all the issues that we were talking about, looted art, war criminals, etc. However, it was far from successful, number of reasons for that. Disputes and interdepartmental rivalries in the United States, particularly between the Treasury and the State Department over who should really lead the operations. And then differences between Washington, which I just noticed a typo, and London over the implementation of it, I think were also very significant as well. The British believed that effectively Washington was using this operation as a means of trying to secure a greater role for America in post-World War II Europe, and specifically a greater economic role over Britain. Two key men who were tasked effectively with Safe Haven. I'm sure you may have heard of these men before. William Donovan, head of the first American Federal Intelligence Agency, the Office of Strategic Services, known as Wild Bill Donovan. This was a man who was very dynamic, whose agents were very dynamic, and he was trying to gather information on all the issues I talked about, often paying informants in the neutral countries lots of US dollars for information that was actually far from reliable. But he was extremely significant in trying to prevent Nazis escaping and from dealing with looted art. He was very much a gung-ho, hands-on man. He landed on the beaches of D-Day he landed on the beaches of France during D-Day. Very risky, but he wanted to be there. And that was in direct contrast to his British counterpart who was involved in this operation, Stuart Menzies. And we talk about this in the book. Stuart Menzies was the head of SIS, MI6. This was a man who had over 400 one-to-one meetings with Sir Winston Churchill during World War II. This was a man who had more private meetings with Churchill than any other individual in Britain. And he was the opposite of Donovan. He was a office-bound man, and he led very cautiously, very conservatively. And there was a great deal of friction between the Americans and the British. And one of the major reasons for that friction was that the American the American OSS, led by Donovan, was very suspicious of British empire demands during the war, and the fact that British were trying to retain the empire. Donovan was very much an anti-colonialist. And Stuart Menzies viewed the Americans as a bunch of amateurs who were just paying for information in these neutral countries and often getting wrong information. The British did have a slight advantage over the Americans in several of these countries, specifically Portugal, Spain, and funnily enough, Argentina as well, where there were very large expat British communities who were well connected with the political regimes there and who were able to help provide relatively significant and reliable information back to the intelligence services. This is a figure that intrigued me, that really got me going in the book when I talked about looted art. 20% of European art was looted by the Nazis, either pre-war or during the war. Think about that figure. Imagine going to the National Gallery in the UK and looking at the pictures and thinking every 1 in 5 pictures wouldn't be here. But that number doesn't really tell the whole story, because that doesn't include a notion of quality that was stolen. You know, some of the most significant pieces of European art were stolen by the Germans. And I talk about both art that the Germans regarded as reflecting their national ethos of National Socialism, and also art that the Germans classified as degenerate art, art by people such as Pablo Picasso, art by people such as Max Ernst. I mean, enormously significant art to the history of the 20th century. And for those of you who know something about the art world, you'll know in 2024, we're celebrating 100 years of surrealism. Since in 1924, André Breton wrote the Manifesto for Surrealism. And many of the surrealist works, of course, are now worth an absolute fortune and considered to be a central part of 20th century art history. What were the aims of the Germans? Now, I came across a fascinating document by the Americans and British, which was written in 1945, right at the end of the war, which went through all the national aims and the various individual aims as well, for the Germans to steal this art. And of course, a huge amount of this art was stolen from Jewish collectors, I should mention as well. The national aims I've already kind of mentioned, you know, to reflect National Socialism. But degenerate art, this was supposed to be destroyed. This was supposed to be burnt and destroyed by the Germans. But it wasn't, because they worked out that this was worth money, and they could steal, loot, and resell this art. Now, this may surprise some people, but prior to the United States joining the war at the end of 1941, New York was one of the most lucrative markets for the sale of this degenerate art by the Germans. And several senior Nazis sold the art in exchange for US dollars, which is what the currency that they wanted to have. And Hitler himself gave permission for this art to be sold. A lot of this art came through Lisbon and was transported on the passenger liners from Lisbon directly into New York, where I should also mention that many of the gallery owners who were buying this art were also of Jewish origin as well. And it was an odd scenario where you have art being stolen from, say, the Paris gallery of Paul Rosenberg, hugely significant French art collector, unofficial agent to Pablo Picasso. Some of that art was taken to New York, confiscated by the Germans, taken to New York and sold. And certainly during other parts of the war, we see sales of art, degenerate art, taking place essentially for get-rich schemes for leading Nazis. And I would term, as I term in the book, that this was incredibly opportunist. And let me introduce you now to the godfather of this operation. The godfather of this operation was Hermann Goering. He knew absolutely nothing about art. He had no interest in art at all. He couldn't have told you the relevance of a wonderful work of art to something that was a piece of rubbish. His only question was, how much was it worth? And Goering exploited looted art for his own personal gains. He set up an enormous network of agents across occupied Europe to secure and sell art. And from D-Day onwards, he really did increase the pace of selling, which indicates, I think, Goering was actually quite smart in realizing that I think the German case was really finished after D-Day. And one of his major agents was a man called Alois Meidel, a German born in Germany, but he was a national citizen of Holland. And he operated a very lucrative business of exporting art to Spain, selling it in Spain, and splitting the benefits with Goering. We know about this because Neill was one of the few people who cooperated with the Allies after the war, and gave the Allies lots of information about Goering's network. And in exchange, he wasn't prosecuted. And he was allowed to keep some of the art as well. And he spent the rest of his days, first of all, living in Madrid, and then he moved to Lisbon, where he was a reputable member of the art scene in the Portuguese capital. And he also invested some of his hard-earned money in mining industries in Angola and in South Africa, Rhodesia, as well, now Zimbabwe. And I think that's a kind of indication of the complexity of bringing some of these people to justice. But this man, Hermann Goering, was the absolute godfather of looted art. Post-war Nazis on the run in the Cold War era, and this man is probably the most significant man, not only for German war criminals, but also looted art as well. Juan Perón stood for election and won the election in 1946 in Argentina. The Americans had tried to stop him by publishing a book called The Blue Book about his wartime collaboration with Germany, but that did little good. He published a book in response called The Blue and White Book, and he positioned himself as the anti-American, anti-imperialist candidate, and he was elected successfully. And from that point on, he actively recruited Nazis to try and go to Argentina to essentially help facilitate the development of an Argentine economy, and specifically an Argentine military sector as well, very much in terms of looking at competition with Brazil. And here we need to look at sort of the historiography of Argentina as well, a little bit, and about different accounts of Perón and what were his motives, and sort of critical accounts and less critical accounts of him as well. And there are major disputes as to how many war criminals actually ended up in Argentina. The Simon and Seaman Wiesenthal Center has a figure that was much higher than other officials put forward by different agencies as well. But in many ways, I think the number was actually kind of less relevant than the kind of key Nazi war criminals who went there, the specific leaders who escaped Allied justice, who were able to get there. And one of the ways that the Nazis living in Argentina funded their continued welcome in Argentina was to sell some of the looted art and treasure they'd exported from Europe. And Juan Perón was very happy to buy this. This was a racketeering operation that the mafia would have been proud of. Juan Perón absolutely just took everything and just took it as payment for effectively services rendered to the Nazis. And Argentina in many ways became the sort of hotbed of looted art, Nazi war criminals, gold coins, etc. after the war. Safe haven finishes in 1948. The world moves on very quickly. Cold War starts. We have new geopolitical realities. I think the Berlin crisis and the Berlin airlift, the Arab-Israeli conflict starting in May 1948. And I cover this a little bit in the book because one of my key characters, a Swedish diplomat who you may have heard of, called Count Folke Bernadotte, who was involved in some of the ties between the Germans and the Swedes, is appointed the first UN envoy to Palestine, and as you probably know, is assassinated by an Irgun paramilitary group in Jerusalem during the first Arab-Israeli war. And I think these Cold War realities really reposition many of these neutral countries as being very useful to the Western alliance. Just to give you a quick example, Portugal and this Azores air base was extremely important to the Americans in flying planes out of America to Europe to build and maintain the American garrison in Germany. Planes didn't refuel in the sky as they do today. And so these type of things led effectively to countries like Portugal cutting a deal whereby they were allowed to keep nearly all their wartime bounty from trade with the Nazis. They gave back only 3.97 tons of gold out of 400 officially. I think it's closer to 800 tons of gold they were allowed to keep. And even Spain, the pariah of World War II, was eventually allowed into the Western Alliance because of its geostrategic position. And Sweden, likewise, of course, was because of its position, closeness to the Baltic, etc., was also encouraged as well. So the operation came very much to an end. And just to finally bring it up to date, it's really only from the Washington Conference on Looted Art on 3rd of December 1998 that we have a set of principles that have been established about looted art now. And these principles, please take this away from this talk, remain extremely important in 2024. And we see a number of paintings still being disputed in terms of ownership. Last year, a Kandinsky painting exchanged hands for $45 million, which the Stern family had been able to secure back from a gallery in Eindhoven in Holland after a protracted legal challenge. We see a legal challenge of another family against the Guggenheim for a Picasso painting, Woman Ironing, which is currently still waiting to be tried or to be judged upon. And these issues are not going away. And thankfully, despite the sad point that the World War II generation are dying out, we are seeing, I think, an increased interest in bringing looted art to justice and looking at issues of restitution. And hopefully these will carry on among the younger generation of scholars and legal experts as they come to the fore. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Neill, for a really fascinating talk. Well, in equal parts fascinating and troubling, this story that you tell. And lots of questions coming both in the chat and also to me privately, so I will relay some of them. And as always, apologies in advance if we don't get to all of them, but I'll try and put them over to you in clumps. But I wonder whether I could start, Neill, by asking you, I'm fascinated to hear a little bit about the human level at which all of this takes place. Can you say a little bit about, first of all, where this art is taken from? You mentioned that a lot of it came from Jewish collectors. Where are they getting the art from? And then also this question of what happens, you know, when it's sold. And you said, you made a comment about how in Argentina they had little interest in where the art came from. I wondered whether that was the case across the board in Spain and Portugal and elsewhere as well. Has research been done into this? What do we know about the afterlife of these artworks, and was it open knowledge where they came from?
Yeah, it's a good point. The art was taken from different areas. Some art was taken from national collections, but not a huge amount. National collections, with the exception of the Dutch, were left intact, I think. A lot of it, of course, was taken from Jewish collectors, and specifically in France. Let me give you two examples. One example was Baron Henri de Rothschild. His wonderful collection of art was seized as part of the wider Nazi policies about seizing all Jewish assets. And that was either taken to Switzerland, Germany, and broken up. The other example I'll give you, which I mentioned, was the Paul Rosenberg Gallery in France, in Paris, which is a wonderful book written by his granddaughter, Anne Sinclair, which was published about Paul Rosenberg. Very, very significant work stolen there by the Germans, and some of those taken to Germany, some taken to Switzerland. And we see still examples of works belonging to that collection still being found. So very, very important there. Also, I think I need to give the audience an important point here, which is there was different kinds of looting and how we term looted art. There was art that was directly looted by the Germans, and which obviously needs to be restituted. But of course, there was art sold under distress as well, mainly by Jews who were victims of Nazi persecution. And people like Baron Henri de Rothschild, we use him again, were forced to sell some of his paintings that were based in London at the National Gallery at a very low rate to finance his exit from Europe, really. And so, I mean, there were different kinds. And some of these sales that took place in Spain and Portugal, there was no interest in the history of the art. There was no real interest. One Swedish gallery owner made a quote, which I think sums it up nicely, when he said, "I suspected that this art had come from those poor Jewish refugees."
Right. So first of all, lots of very appreciative comments in the chat. So I will convey those to you if you've not seen them. So let me start with a series of questions that are around what happened to some of these treasures. So one question was, what looted treasures besides artworks were sent to neutral countries? Another related question, how much liberated art and objects were taken as souvenirs by Allied soldiers? And then a general question, someone asks, what percentage of that looted art has actually been recovered?
Okay. What was the first question again? Sorry, Shirley, I missed the first one.
Were there other treasures besides the art?
Oh, okay, sorry, got it. Yeah, other treasures included sculptures were very popular, and rare manuscripts were actually a very lucrative sale as well. Book collections, libraries, also other treasures included, of course, things like diamonds, jewels, etc. It really was almost everything that you can imagine falling under the sort of genre of treasure. And in terms of the Allied soldiers, that answer, I don't know. There were stiff penalties for Allies caught looting who were moving through Europe, liberating Europe. I don't have any documentary evidence to suggest that this was in any way other than maybe the occasional example of someone lifting something as a souvenir. And the other question, which focused on what is the percentage that is still, we don't know. We think there was a survey done around about 2020, which said at least 100,000 pieces of art. But that's a very approximate number, and I'm not sure how much I really buy into that. But certainly many pieces of art simply disappeared. Now, we also have to factor in that quite a bit of art was destroyed in the fighting. And let's look at the Italian theater, for example. The British bombing of the Italian theater was very indiscriminate, and Allied bombing of Italy led certainly to a significant loss of art and cultural works in that country. So this makes the figure very difficult, I think, to calculate.
Yeah. A question that came up very early in your talk, but which I wanted to relay was, were the rat lines known to higher-ups like Hitler?
Yes. Officially, and this came from Walter Schellenberg, the head of German intelligence, there was no orchestrated German plan of escape. That was considered treason. However, when you look at the testimony of Walter Schellenberg, who was one of the few Nazis who cooperated with the British, the Allies after the war, Schellenberg says that essentially every senior German officer was considering on a personal, individual basis their potential lines of escape. And the establishment of these rat lines were known all the way to the very top, and not only Hitler, but Himmler as well knew about their presence, and nobody wanted to utilize them straight away. And I think for many Nazis, the appeal of the rat lines was not particularly strong at first, because they wanted to wait and see for two things. Firstly, those who were in the Western Allies side of Germany, they wanted to lie low to see if they could remain at liberty. And secondly, they believed that eventually they would prove useful to the Allies. to the Western allies, and that a coming conflict with the Soviet Union, which they believed was inevitable, the ideological conflict coming, would see them becoming very useful. And for many Nazis, including people like Richard Geffen, this came true. Geffen committed terrible atrocities in Eastern Europe, but his men interviewed every single captured Red Army prisoner. They filed documentary records. They hid them in Switzerland, in milk churns in Switzerland. And Geffen cut a deal with the Allies to exchange this information with them. And what happened to him? Well, he became the head of West German intelligence.
A couple of questions about whether where other countries might fit into the story. There was a question about Ukraine, which of course was not a separate country at that point, but Ukraine, about Paraguay, role of the Soviet Union. I don't know if you want to comment on any of those.
Soviet Union, Paraguay, the Soviet Union were absolutely ruthless with looted art. Any art they came across when they occupied Germany was seen as part of reparations against the Germans. No matter who had originally owned the art, the Soviets just basically lifted everything. Thank you very much. This is ours now. And the Soviet policy was really, I think, very clear on it. In terms of Paraguay, Paraguay became very significant to this story after Mossad kidnapped Eichmann. It terrified the Nazis in Argentina, and specifically in two places in Argentina, Buenos Aires and Cordoba, where most of them were based, that they believed that essentially more Mossad operations would take place. And they also believed that the Argentines had compromised them as well with Mossad, which was not actually right, but this is what they believed. So many of them chose to head out of Argentina, and Paraguay was one of their most sought after destinations. And again, they had to pay security money to the local Paraguay authorities, but they were, many of them were very happy to do so. Others, as I said, moved on to Brazil, which at the start of the 1960s had a military coup d'etat, and the military leadership in Brazil, which had had close relations with the Nazis prior to World War II, gave them refuge, providing they shut up and didn't intervene in Brazilian politics.
Thank you. Well, there are more questions, but in the interest of time, we have just 90 seconds left to keep our event within the hour, as we normally do. I want to take this opportunity to thank you again, Neill, for taking the time to come and talk to the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre. Thank you to all of you for joining us. A reminder that you can buy Neill's book on Amazon. There we go. I put the link into the chat again for those of you who are interested. And Neill, I'm glad to say that there have been already some comments in the chat saying people have bought your book. A reminder of our next events. Alan Packwood, who is the director of the Churchill Archive Centre at Cambridge, is offering a 4-part course on Churchill's D-Day. That's starting on the 15th of February. And on the 21st of February, we're going to have David Kenyon speaking about Bletchley Park, the Second World War code-breaking site in the UK. So please do join us for those events. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you so much again, Neill. See you all again soon.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.